The hallway was narrow, lined with steel-gray walls that hummed faintly from the machinery embedded deep within the naval compound. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered with their steady, sterile glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt, carried in from the sea. Footsteps echoed in the distance as sailors hurried about their duties. But here, in this corridor, the sound seemed to vanish into silence. It was an isolated corner of the base, a place where words carried weight and eyes could lock without distraction. Lieutenant James Carter strode confidently down the passageway, his boots striking in sharp rhythm. He was young, too young. Some whispered for the authority he carried on his shoulders. But his recent successes in drills, his reputation for aggressive tactics, and his polished uniform gave him a sense of superiority that tripped from every step. In his mind, he was destined for greatness, and nothing not tradition, not discipline, not humility would slow his rise. He turned the corner sharply and nearly collided with her. The woman stood quietly, leaning slightly against the wall, as though waiting for something or someone. She was dressed in a simple dark jacket and plain slacks, attire that gave away nothing about her status. No ribbons, no stars, no nameplate gleamed on her chest. She carried herself with an unsettling calm, her posture straight but unassuming. To James, she looked like any other civilian administrator who had wandered into the wrong wing. He narrowed his eyes, irritated at the interruption. "You shouldn't be here," he said sharply, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to being a maid. "This is a restricted section. Do you even know where you're standing?" Her eyes met his with an unreadable stillness. They were sharp, cold, like the deep ocean, steady and endless. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't offer an excuse. James stepped closer, towering slightly over her, using his presence as a weapon. He had done it before, with recruits and even junior officers leaning in, cutting off their escape, forcing them to shrink under his gaze. Power, he believed, was about control, and control was maintained through intimidation. "You don't just wander around military corridors," he continued, lowering his voice as he placed one hand against the wall near her shoulder. "Especially not near command offices. Do you have clearance? Do you even work here?" Still, she said nothing. A silence gnawed at him. It wasn't the silence of fear, nor the silence of guilt. It was deliberate, measured, the kind of silence that unbalanced a man without him realizing why. For the first time in years, James felt a flicker of unease, though he quickly shoved it down, replacing it with arrogance. He smirked, leaning closer. "You know, ignoring an officer isn't wise. I'm asking you a question, and I expect an answer." Finally, she tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. Her lips curved, not into a smile, not into a frown, but into something far sharper. A gesture of someone who knew far more than they let on. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled, carrying a weight that pressed into the silence. "Lieutenant Carter." The sound of his name on her lips made him blink. He hadn't introduced himself. She shouldn't have known who he was. His smirk faltered for the first time. She stepped forward then, not away from his hand on the wall, but directly into the narrow space between them. Her calmness unsettled him, more than anger ever could. He tried to hold her gaze, but there was something there, an intensity, a certainty that made him feel suddenly, impossibly small. "You should be careful about where you place your confidence," she said softly. James stiffened, his pride bristling. "And you should be careful about how you speak to an officer." He shot back, though his voice carried less strength than before. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Her eyes flashed briefly, and then she reached into the folds of her jacket. For a moment, James thought she might produce identification papers or clearance documents, something to prove her right to stand here. Instead, What she pulled free was far more devastating. The light caught on metal. 5 stars. They gleamed against the dim glow of the corridor, as sharp and merciless as a blade. His breath caught. His body went rigid. His brain scrambled to process what his eyes had just seen, but there was no denying it. The insignia was unmistakable. Fleet Admiral. The words screamed in his mind, echoing louder than his pounding heartbeat. Every ounce of arrogance drained from him in an instant, leaving only the cold taste of fear. His throat tightened. His hand slipped from the wall as though burned, and he stumbled back a step, desperate to put distance between himself and the realization of his mistake. "Ma'am, Admiral I." The words tangled on his tongue, collapsing under the weight of his panic. He had cornered her, spoken down to her, tried to intimidate her. And she was the highest-ranking officer in the fleet, a living legend whose name carried through every corridor of the Navy. She watched him without expression, the 5 stars gleaming in her hand. The silence returned, but now it was suffocating. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, no raised volume. It didn't need to. "Step aside, Lieutenant." The order was simple, but it might as well have been a hammer blow. His spine snapped straight. His boots moved instinctively, pressing him against the wall as she strode forward. She didn't look at him again, didn't acknowledge his stammered apologies. Her presence alone crushed him, reminding him of the abyss that separated arrogance from authority. As she disappeared down the corridor, James stood frozen, his chest heaving, his uniform suddenly heavy with shame. He had believed himself untouchable, a rising star. But in less than 5 minutes, he had been humbled more thoroughly than in all his years of service. The corridor was silent again, but the echo of her command sharp, final, absolute remained, burned into his memory. And for the first time, Lieutenant James Carter understood what fear of respect truly felt like. The corridor still hummed with the faint throb of machinery, but to Lieutenant James Carter, it felt as though the entire base had gone silent. His pulse still hammered from the encounter. His ears rang with the single command she had spoken, "Step aside." A phrase so ordinary, yet delivered with such absolute authority that it carried the weight of an order that could crush his career, even his life. Fleet Admiral. The title rattled around his skull like a loose shell casing. He couldn't believe it. The woman he had cornered, the one he had spoken to like a disobedient recruit, was the highest-ranking officer in the Navy, a legend in uniform. And she had known his name. That single fact sent a chill down his spine. She had recognized him instantly, while he had dismissed her as a mere staffer. The arrogance of the mistake burned like acid in his chest. James remained in the hallway long after she left, staring at the empty space she had occupied, as if trying to piece together how reality had shifted so violently in the span of minutes. He prided himself on control, yet now his legs shook with the nervous energy of a cornered animal. Finally, a voice snapped him out of his daze. "Lieutenant Carter?" He spun around to see Ensign Michaels, a junior officer, watching him curiously. James forced his shoulders back, fighting to compose himself, though his face was pale. "Report to the briefing room," Michaels said. "The Admiral is addressing the senior staff." The words struck like lightning. The Admiral. Not just an admiral, the Admiral. The very same woman he had just humiliated himself in front of. His stomach dropped. The briefing room was buzzing with anticipation when James entered. Its polished wood tables and large wall screens a stark contrast to the cold steel corridors outside. Officers of every rank filled the space, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, their attention drawn to the figure standing at the head of the room. Her, Fleet Admiral Evelyn Harrington. She stood tall, commanding without effort, her plain dark uniform now bearing the insignia that had shattered James's arrogance. 5 stars gleamed on her collar, the rarest rank in the naval hierarchy reserved for legends. Her gaze swept the room, calm yet piercing, and conversation ceased instantly. James slid into a seat at the back, trying to make himself invisible. "Gentlemen, ladies," Harrington began, her voice steady, measured, the kind that filled the room without needing to rise. "We are entering an era of uncertainty. The seas are no longer the only battlefield. Information, technology, and discipline are as vital as firepower." Her words flowed with precision, outlining upcoming exercises, new fleet strategies, and the importance of unity in an increasingly fractured world. She spoke of challenges yet to come, of alliances that must be forged, and enemies who would test their resolve. Every officer listened in rapt silence. Not a pen scratched, not a cough echoed. Even the ventilation system seemed to quiet itself in deference. But for James, the speech was both awe-inspiring and torturous. Each word reminded him of the canyon between her greatness and his arrogance. He had stood inches from her face, smirking, condescending, ignorant. Now, sitting among peers, he felt like a child who had trespassed into a kingdom far beyond his reach. Then it happened. As her eyes swept across the room, they landed on him. It was brief, just a flicker, a passing glance, but it seared him more than a spotlight. Her gaze was unreadable, neither condemning nor forgiving. But it was a reminder. "I know who you are. I remember what you did." James dropped his eyes to the table, his throat dry. The briefing concluded with the Admiral's final words. "Leadership is not about power. It is about responsibility. Every star I wear is not for me. It is for the thousands of men and women whose lives I'm entrusted to protect. Remember that the next time you put on your uniform." The officers rose, saluting in unison. Harrington returned the salute, then exited the room with the quiet dignity of a woman who had no need to prove herself. She was proof incarnate. James remained frozen in his seat. As the room emptied, he sat alone, his mind replaying her words. Responsibility, not power. He realized with a sinking heart how deeply he had misunderstood everything about leadership. His pride had blinded him, and now the weight of his failure pressed down like chains. Later that evening, James found himself outside on the deck, staring out at the endless horizon where the ocean met the sky. The salty wind whipped at his face, stinging his eyes. The stars glittered above, and he wondered how many of them she had already claimed in her service, how many victories bore her name. He remembered the way she had looked at him, not with hatred, but with an authority so complete that it made his own confidence seem like a child's tantrum. She hadn't needed to shout, to threaten, to boast. Her very presence was enough. He gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the railing. He hated the feeling, this gnawing shame, this loss of control. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. Curiosity. Who was Fleet Admiral Evelyn Harrington, truly? How had she risen so high, broken through barriers so firmly cemented in tradition? And why had she spared him? By rights, she could have ended his career with a single report. One word, one signature, and James Carter would have been dismissed, his record tarnished beyond repair. But she hadn't. Instead, she had simply told him to step aside. It was almost as if she had chosen to test him. The thought kept him awake long into the night, his mind wrestling with the revelation. The next morning, orders arrived. Lieutenant Carter was to report directly to the Admiral's command wing. Effective immediately, he was reassigned under her direct supervision. When he read the message, his stomach twisted. Was this punishment? A second chance? A deliberate lesson? As he approached her office, his boots echoing against the steel floor, he realized he didn't know what terrified him more, her wrath or her silence. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and raised his hand to knock. Inside, Fleet Admiral Harrington was waiting. Fleet Admiral Evelyn Harrington was not born into command, nor into privilege. Long before 5 stars gleamed on her collar, before her name carried weight in every naval corridor, she was simply Evelyn, an ambitious daughter of a dockworker and a schoolteacher in a weather-worn coastal town. Her childhood was filled with the sound of waves crashing against rusted hulls, the clatter of gulls, and the stories her father told of the sea. She listened wide-eyed as he described ships larger than city blocks, engines that roared like storms, and sailors who braved waters darker than midnight. The sea, to her, was freedom and danger, a vast canvas waiting to be conquered. But Evelyn's dreams were often dismissed. The Navy? Neighbors scoffed. That's not for girls. Even her own teachers urged her to think smaller. Teaching, nursing, those are fine careers. Evelyn refused. At 16, she applied for the Naval Academy, a fortress of tradition where women made up less than 5% of the cadets. Her entrance exams were grueling, designed to break those who thought the Navy could be conquered through willpower alone. Many faltered. Evelyn endured. She outlasted sleepless nights of study, blistering physical trials, and the quiet ridicule of peers who thought she didn't belong. By the time she stood on the parade ground in her crisp uniform, she had already learned her first lesson. Respect was never given. It had to be earned, inch by bloody inch. Her academy years forged her like steel and fire. She excelled in strategy, mastering naval history, tactics, and simulations with a brilliance that caught even her instructors off guard. In the field, she pushed herself harder than anyone else running drills until her lungs screamed, climbing ropes until her palms bled. She refused shortcuts, but brilliance invited resistance. Male cadets, jealous or threatened, tried to undermine her. Once, her bunk was trashed, her uniform shredded in a cruel act meant to humiliate. Another time, a rival spread rumors that she had seduced an instructor to earn her grades. Evelyn answered both not with words, but with performance. She rose higher, scored better, and led harder until no whisper could eclipse the undeniable fact. She was exceptional. Graduating near the top of her class, she was assigned her first command post aboard a mid-sized destroyer. For the first time, she stood on deck with the ocean stretching endlessly before her, the salt air in her lungs, and men twice her age waiting for her orders. She earned their respect not by barking louder, but by standing firmer. She learned their names, their fears, their hopes. She was stern when needed, fair when possible, and unflinching when tested. Slowly, a crew once skeptical grew fiercely loyal. Her rise through the ranks was anything but smooth. She served during tense years, when conflicts erupted without warning, when supply lines were ambushed, and when storms at sea tore lesser captains apart. Evelyn thrived where others faltered. In one early deployment, her ship was caught in the crossfire of hostile fleets. Outnumbered 2-1, her superiors ordered retreat. Evelyn saw an opening in unguarded flank, an enemy weakness masked by arrogance. Against protocol, she struck. The maneuver was reckless, but her gamble paid off. The enemy was crippled, her crew victorious. Though reprimanded for defying orders, she earned the unspoken respect of those who witnessed it. Sailors whispered of her fearlessness, her uncanny ability to see opportunities others missed. War tested her further. During a devastating campaign overseas, she commanded relief operations under relentless bombardment. Supplies ran thin, casualties mounted, and morale crumbled. Evelyn refused despair. She rationed carefully, worked alongside medics, and stood on the front lines during every assault. Her men began calling her the Iron Tide, a commander who never bent, never broke, even when the storm threatened to drown them all. But her greatest battle wasn't with enemies abroad, it was at home, within the very institution she served. The higher she climbed, the harder tradition fought to pull her down. Promotion boards delayed her advancement, citing concerns about stability. Some admirals outright told her, "The Navy isn't ready for this." Still, she persisted. Every assignment she accepted became a proving ground. Every victory made denial harder. By the time she reached Rear Admiral, she had commanded more ships, logged more hours at sea, and faced more combat zones than most of her peers combined. Then came the defining moment of her career. A hostile fleet threatened a critical shipping route, and command hesitated, uncertain of their response. Evelyn stepped forward, volunteering to lead the operation. The battle lasted 3 brutal days, with weather, exhaustion, and firepower stacked against her. She orchestrated maneuvers so daring, they were later studied in academies. Feigned retreats, surprise ambushes, and precise strikes that left the enemy fleet crippled. When the smoke cleared, the route was secure. Her ships limped back battered but victorious, and thousands of civilian lives were saved. The world took notice. Promotions followed quickly after. Vice Admiral, then Admiral, and finally the rank no woman in the Navy had ever held before, Fleet Admiral. 5 stars stitched onto her collar, glittering proof of her unyielding climb. James Carter knew none of this in detail when he first met her in the corridor. All he had seen was a woman in plain clothes, quiet and unassuming. What he couldn't have known was the lifetime of storms she had already weathered, the battles fought in silence, the sacrifices made without applause. What made her truly fearsome wasn't just her record, her medals, or her victories. It was her presence. She carried decades of earned authority with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove herself anymore. She had been doubted, dismissed, undermined, and she had crushed every obstacle in her path, not through force, but through endurance, vision, and unbreakable will. When Evelyn Harrington walked into a room, she didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of her history walked with her. That night, alone in his quarters, James researched her. He pulled up records, reports, archived interviews. With each page, his shame deepened. The woman he had tried to intimidate had commanded fleets before he was even old enough to enlist. She had stood in storms, stared down enemies, and carried men from burning decks on her shoulders. Her story left him humbled. And yet, beneath his humiliation, something shifted. Admiration crept in, reluctant but undeniable. He had seen many officers bark orders and flaunt ranks, but none who commanded through silence, through sheer respect. He wondered if he would ever have the strength to carry even a fraction of her weight. For the first time in his career, Lieutenant James Carter felt the stirrings of true reverence, and it terrified him. The days following the encounter dragged like anchors. For Lieutenant James Carter, the once familiar rhythm of naval life felt foreign, suffocating. He woke each morning to the shrill buzz of his alarm, dressed in his crisp uniform, and marched through the base as though nothing had changed. But inside, he was unraveling. Everywhere he went, he imagined whispers. In the mess hall, when forks scraped plates and cups clinked, he swore he heard hushed voices behind him. That's him, the one who cornered the Admiral. In training drills, when laughter echoed from the younger officers, he thought it was at his expense. Even silence mocked him. The corridors, once a stage for his swagger, now loomed like galleries of judgmental eyes. At night, sleep eluded him. He tossed on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the hallway. Over and over. Her calm stare. The gleam of 5 stars. His arrogant smirk dissolving into fear. The memory clung to him like a stain. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize, I didn't know, she wasn't in uniform. Anyone could have made the mistake. The truth cut deeper. His arrogance had blinded him. He hadn't just disrespected a superior. He had disrespected the embodiment of everything the Navy stood for. His temper worsened. During a weapons inspection, he barked at a junior sailor for misplacing a rifle strap. The sailor flinched, eyes wide, and James saw himself reflected in the boy's fear. It made his stomach turn. He dismissed the crew early, then locked himself in his quarters. For the first time, he admitted what he had long denied. His authority came not from respect, but from fear. And fear, he now knew, was fragile. The breaking point came one evening during a strategy seminar. Officers gathered around the briefing table, reviewing simulated battle scenarios. James usually thrived in these discussions, relishing the chance to flex his tactical knowledge. But that night, when it was his turn to present, his throat tightened. His mind, usually quick, fogged with doubt. He stumbled over his words, presenting an aggressive maneuver with half-hearted conviction. When the instructor raised an eyebrow and asked, "Are you confident in that plan, Lieutenant?" James faltered. Confidence had once been his armor. Now it was gone. The room fell into an uneasy silence. James muttered an apology and sat down. For the first time since joining the Navy, he felt small, insignificant. Rumors began to spread, subtle but sharp. Carter's lost his edge. Did you hear what he did? The Admiral herself saw it. His once polished reputation, built on bravado and sharp drills, was slipping through his fingers like sand. In quiet moments, he wondered if his career was already finished. If the Admiral had chosen not to end him formally, perhaps she had decided on a slower execution, letting his shame rot him from the inside until he crumbled. Yet another possibility gnawed at him. What if this was deliberate? What if her silence wasn't indifference, but design? What if she was watching, waiting to see whether he drowned in shame or clawed his way out of it? The thought both terrified and motivated him. One night, unable to sleep, James wandered the base alone. The moonlight spilled silver over the water, reflecting the massive silhouettes of docked ships. He walked along the pier until he reached the end, where the waves slapped against barnacle-covered pylons. He leaned on the railing, staring into the dark abyss below. He thought of his family, his father, a decorated Marine who had drilled into him that strength was everything. His mother, who had insisted he carry himself like a man destined for greatness. He had lived his entire life as though pride was the only currency that mattered. And it had brought him here to humiliation, to sleepless nights, to the edge of failure. He whispered into the wind, almost as if confessing to the sea itself. I don't know who I am without it. But the ocean, like the Admiral, offered no answer. Only silence. The following day, fate forced his hand. James was ordered to report to Fleet Admiral Harrington's command office. His stomach dropped when he read the summons. For hours he rehearsed apologies in his head, searching for words that might salvage what little dignity he had left. None felt sufficient. How do you apologize to someone who embodies the very institution you had insulted? He approached her office with boots polished to perfection, uniform pressed to sharpness, posture stiff with rehearsed composure. Still, his hands sweated beneath his gloves. A Marine guard outside opened the door. James stepped in. The room was vast yet minimal polished wood desk, world maps on the walls, models of ships arrayed neatly on shelves. At the center sat Admiral Harrington, reviewing a dossier. She didn't look up immediately, forcing James to stand at attention, nerves gnawing at him. Finally, she closed the folder and met his gaze. Lieutenant Carter, she said evenly. Admiral, he croaked, his voice betraying his anxiety. She studied him for a long moment, her silence deliberate. The weight of it pressed on him harder than any scolding. Then she leaned back, folding her hands. You've been restless, she said. Your performance has slipped. You doubt yourself. James swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in evaluation. Tell me why. He froze. No excuse would suffice. He couldn't lie, she'd see through it instantly. So with his pride stripped bare, he admitted the truth. Because I was arrogant, he said, his voice low. Because I forgot what leadership means. And because I disrespected you. The room fell silent. James's heart pounded, waiting for her verdict. At last, Harrington spoke. You are not the first officer to mistake arrogance for strength. And you won't be the last. What matters is whether you learn before arrogance destroys you and those under your command. Her words sliced deep, but there was no malice in them. Only truth. Then, to his shock, she slid a folder across the desk toward him. Inside were orders, reassignment under her direct command. Effective immediately. You will serve with me, she said. You will observe, you will listen, and you will learn. Consider this your final chance to understand what the uniform you wear truly means. James's breath caught. Punishment would have been easier. But this was something else entirely. A test. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. As he left her office, the weight of his shame remained, but beneath it flickered something new. Not arrogance. Not fear, resolve. That night, as James prepared for his new assignment, he looked into the mirror. His reflection stared back, haunted yet determined. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing glory or recognition. He wasn't trying to prove he was stronger than everyone else. For the first time, he wanted to be worthy. And he knew the Admiral would accept nothing less. The first morning under Fleet Admiral Harrington's direct command began before dawn. The base was cloaked in a gray mist, the kind that blurred ship outlines into ghostly shapes. Lieutenant James Carter reported to the Admiral's flagship, a towering destroyer anchored in the harbor, its steel hull gleaming under floodlights. Standing at the gangway, he swallowed hard. His uniform was spotless, his posture rigid, but his insides churned with unease. This wasn't just reassignment. It was scrutiny. Every move he made, every word he spoke, would now be measured against the Admiral's impossible standards. When he boarded, the boatswain's whistle shrieked, announcing his arrival. The crew, seasoned and sharp, eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They knew who he was. They knew what he had done. Whispers followed him down the deck like shadows. Lieutenant Carter, reporting as ordered, he said crisply, saluting at the Admiral's presence on the bridge. Harrington returned the salute without expression. You're late, she said, though his watch confirmed he was 5 minutes early. James blinked, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. The lesson had already begun. From the outset, Harrington gave him no mercy. She assigned him tasks far beneath his rank, supervising equipment inventory, assisting with navigation charts, even carrying reports between departments. To others, it might have felt humiliating, but James recognized the intent. She was stripping him of ego, forcing him to see the mechanics of leadership from the ground up. On his second day, she walked him through the ship's engine room. The roar of turbines and the scent of grease filled the air as sailors worked tirelessly to keep the destroyer's heart alive. Harrington stopped beside a crewman whose hands were black with oil. Tell me, Lieutenant, she said, gesturing to the sailor. Who leads this man? James answered quickly. His chief engineer, ma'am. And who leads the chief? You, Admiral. She gave him a sharp look. No, you're wrong. The ship leads him. The mission leads him. I am not his master. I am his servant. My job is to give him the tools, direction, and trust to succeed. If I fail, the ship fails. If I fail, he dies. That is leadership. James said nothing, the weight of her words pressing on him harder than the rumble of the engines. Days turned into weeks. Harrington continued her relentless tutelage. On the bridge, she quizzed him about storm navigation while waves slammed against the bow. In wargaming drills, she demanded he defend strategies under brutal questioning, tearing apart every assumption until he learned to think beyond ego. But the hardest lessons were not in tactics. They were in humanity. One evening, Harrington ordered him to accompany her to the sickbed. A young sailor had collapsed during training and now lay pale and trembling on a cot. The medic explained that the sailor had been hiding an untreated illness out of fear of appearing weak. James looked at the boy with pity, but Harrington fixed her gaze on Carter instead. "Why do you think he did this?" she asked. James hesitated. "Fear of letting down his unit?" "Fear of letting down me," Harrington corrected softly. "That is my failure. A sailor who fears his admiral more than he values his own health will one day die for the wrong reason. Leadership is not about commanding sacrifice. It's about making sure sacrifice is never wasted." That night, James lay awake, haunted by the admiral's words. For years, he had equated command with dominance, authority with fear. But fear had limits. Respect endured. One particularly grueling day tested him to his core. The destroyer conducted live fire exercises off the coast, simulating hostile engagement. Harrington placed James in charge of the gunnery team. It was his first real responsibility under her watch. At first, adrenaline surged through him. He barked orders, demanding precision and speed. But under pressure, the sailors grew tense. A misfire delayed their drill, and James erupted, berating them with harsh words. Silence fell. The gunnery crew stiffened, faces hardening with resentment. Behind him, Harrington's voice cut like a blade. "Enough, Lieutenant." He froze, then turned slowly. She stood at the hatch, eyes cold as steel. "Step outside," she ordered. On the deck, the wind whipped around them. James braced himself for a verbal lashing. But her voice was low, controlled, which somehow made it worse. "You've learned nothing," she said. "You think shouting makes men obey. It doesn't. It makes them hesitate. And hesitation kills." James opened his mouth, then closed it. Shame burned in his chest. She leaned closer, her tone fierce but calm. The measure of a leader isn't how loudly he commands. It's how willingly men follow when the noise of battle drowns every order. Until you understand that, you are dangerous. Her words cut deeper than anger ever could. The next day, James did something he had never done before. He apologized. He gathered the gunnery team, his posture humble, voice steady. "Yesterday, I failed you. I led with my pride instead of my head. That won't happen again." The sailors exchanged wary glances, uncertain whether to trust his sincerity. But in their silence, James sensed a shift, not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest thread of respect. And it was enough. Over the following weeks, James began to change. His arrogance softened into quiet confidence. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions where once he would have boasted answers. He noticed the crew responding differently, not with fear, but with cooperation. Harrington, though she never praised him outright, watched closely. Each small victory was met with the same calm indifference, forcing him to seek validation not in her approval, but in his own integrity. One evening, after a long day of drills, Harrington finally addressed him privately. "You're learning," she said simply. James nodded. "Because you're teaching." Her gaze sharpened. "No, because you're finally willing to learn." The lesson crystallized during a sudden storm at sea. The destroyer pitched violently as 20-foot waves battered its hull. Visibility dropped to near zero. Panic rippled through the crew, but Harrington remained composed. She turned to James. "The bridge is yours." His heart thundered. The Admiral was handing him command in the middle of chaos. He drew a deep breath, recalling her teachings. Instead of shouting, he spoke with clarity. Instead of posturing, he listened to his officers' input, weaving their expertise into decisive orders. Hours later, when the storm finally broke and the seas calmed, the ship remained intact, the crew unharmed. Exhausted, James looked across the bridge at Harrington. For the first time, she allowed the faintest flicker of approval in her eyes. And James realized he no longer needed more than that. That night, standing alone on the deck, as stars emerged above the horizon, James finally understood. Leadership wasn't about glory. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about the man standing at the front of the line. It was about responsibility for every soul, every decision, every sacrifice. And in that moment, he vowed that he would never again mistake arrogance for strength. Not while Fleet Admiral Harrington commanded the sea, and not while he carried the lessons she had etched into him. The sea has a way of testing men when they least expect it. For Lieutenant James Carter, the test came on a night so deceptively calm that even seasoned sailors let their guard down. The destroyer Resolute, under Fleet Admiral Harrington's command, cut silently across dark waters. The horizon was smooth, the stars bright, and the hum of the engines almost soothing. James was on duty at the bridge, monitoring radar alongside the watch team. His posture was steady, his eyes sharp. Weeks of Harrington's relentless mentorship had toughened him, stripped away the arrogance that once blinded him. Yet part of him still wondered, had he truly changed, or was he only pretending until the next storm tore him open? The answer arrived sooner than he thought. Shortly after midnight, the radar operator stiffened. Unidentified contact, bearing 210, closing fast. James leaned forward. Range? 40 nautical miles and decreasing, sir. At first, he thought it might be a civilian vessel. But the speed was wrong, too fast for commercial shipping, too erratic for routine military exercises. Within minutes, the contact split into 3 separate returns. Multiple vessels. His stomach tightened. "Sound general quarters," he ordered, voice calm but firm. The klaxon blared through the ship, rousing sailors from their bunks. Boots pounded on steel as men scrambled to their stations. Admiral Harrington entered the bridge moments later, her expression unreadable. She didn't seize command, didn't question his judgment. She simply stood at his side, arms folded, watching. It was his test. The radar lit up again. The vessels were now 20 miles out. The communications officer shook his head. "No response to hails, sir." James clenched his jaw. Whoever they were, they weren't friendly. He felt every pair of eyes on him, waiting. He thought of how he once barked orders to fill the silence, desperate to appear in control. This time, he forced himself to breathe. He recalled Harrington's words. A leader doesn't command obedience. He earns trust. He looked to his officers. Options? The navigator spoke first. "We can change course east, buy time." A weapons officer added, "Or bring the guns to bear now, sir." Show them we're not passive. James considered both, weighing risks. Fear clawed at his insides, but he didn't let it rule him. Instead, he asked the radar operator, "Speed of approach?" 35 knots and climbing. James nodded. Aggressive. Too aggressive. He turned to the helm. "Bring us to defensive formation. Slow to 15 knots. Keep our bow toward them." It wasn't retreat, but it wasn't provocation either. It was balance. And minutes dragged. The vessels closed to within 10 miles. Through binoculars, the lookout confirmed. 3 fast attack craft, low to the water, bristling with weapons. Their intentions were no longer in doubt. The crew tensed. Fingers hovered over triggers, breath quickened. James felt it too, the surge of adrenaline, the instinct to shout, to demand, to release the pressure with orders. But he didn't. He steadied his voice, speaking clearly. Guns ready, but hold fire. No one shoots unless I say. The bridge was quiet, save for the steady ping of the radar and the thrum of engines. Outside, the black water shimmered under moonlight, each wave a potential hiding place for death. At 5 miles, the attack craft split formation, flanking wide. It was a classic maneuver forced the destroyer to divide its attention. James's pulse quickened. For a split second, doubt flared. Am I about to get us all killed? Then Harrington's voice brushed his ear, low enough only he could hear. Trust what you've learned, Lieutenant. It wasn't an order. It was a reminder. James exhaled slowly. His voice rang across the bridge. Helm 30 degrees starboard. Weapons lock forward battery on lead vessel, secondary on the flanks. Comes send last warning. Alter course, or we will fire. The ship shifted underfoot, metal groaning as it carved through the waves. Guns swiveled, targeting systems locking onto the approaching threats. Seconds ticked by. No response. 3 miles. 2. The air was thick, electric, as if the sea itself held its breath. Then, one of the attack craft fired tracer rounds, slicing across the water, splashing harmlessly short of the destroyer's bow. A warning shot, but hostile all the same. The crew erupted, voices overlapping. Return fire. They're hostile. Orders, sir? James felt the heat of decision crash into him. This was it. His call. Hold. He barked, louder than the chaos. Not yet. The crew froze, stunned. Harrington's eyes never left him. The attack craft closed within 1 mile. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. More rounds screamed toward them, sparking harmlessly off the destroyer's reinforced hull. The crew braced for impact. James's jaw set. His hesitation could cost lives. But his panic had sharpened into clarity. He raised his hand. Fire! The destroyer roared to life. Deck guns thundered. Missiles streaked through the night, and the sea lit up with fire. The lead attack craft exploded in a bloom of flame, scattering debris across the waves. The flanking vessels turned hard, retreating at full speed. Cheers erupted across the bridge, sailors slapping consoles, shouting victory. But James didn't cheer. He watched the burning wreckage drift on the waves, illuminated by the glow of destruction. He swallowed hard. Cease fire. Rescue teams ready. If there are survivors, we pick them up. The crew hesitated, surprised. These men had attacked them. Why save them? But James's voice carried conviction. We don't leave sailors to die at sea. Not even enemies. Hours later, survivors from the destroyed craft were pulled aboard. They were disarmed, treated for burns and shrapnel wounds, and confined under guard. James walked among them, seeing fear and hatred in their eyes. Yet he also saw something else, a reflection of himself. Once arrogant, now humbled by forces larger than he understood. On the bridge, Harrington finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a glimmer of respect beneath it. You held the line. You didn't break. And when you had the power to destroy completely, you chose restraint. James turned to her, searching her face. Was it enough? She studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he'd been under her command, she smiled barely, but enough. It was leadership, she said. When dawn broke, the sea was calm again. The wreckage was gone, the rescued enemies secured, and the crew weary but alive. James stood at the bow, salt wind on his face, watching the horizon. For the first time, He felt not like a boy chasing glory, but like a man carrying responsibility. The weight was heavy, but it was his to bear. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered, not just on the sea, but in the hearts of those aboard the Resolute. Sailors moved quietly, repairing damage, checking equipment, and recounting the night's events in hushed tones. The attack had tested them all, and each survivor carried scars unseen by the untrained eye. Lieutenant James Carter walked the deck, his boots soft against wet steel. The air still held the tongue of salt and smoke, and the waves lapped against the hull with a restless rhythm. He moved from crewman to crewman, observing silently, offering guidance without condescension. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. In its place, measured confidence, earned not from rank, but from action. "Lieutenant," a sailor called, approaching with a repaired targeting console. "Everything's operational now." "Good work," James said, genuine pride in his voice. "Double-check your calibrations. The next exercise isn't forgiving." The sailor nodded, a faint respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For James, these small moments, the acknowledgement of competence, the quiet trust, were more rewarding than any medal or commendation. Fleet Admiral Harrington appeared on deck as the sun rose, casting long golden shadows across the waves. She moved with her usual poise, the kind of authority that didn't demand attention but commanded it. James stopped his rounds and saluted. "Stand at ease, Lieutenant," she said, voice calm. "The crew is talking about last night." He stiffened. Praise from the Admiral was rare, even after the crisis. He dared a glance. "They're calling it decisive," she continued. "But more importantly, they're calling it measured. You didn't just survive, you earned their trust. That's leadership." James exhaled slowly. The weight on his shoulders felt different now, less oppressive. It was still responsibility, still accountability, but now tempered with the knowledge that competence and respect could coexist. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, voice steady. Harrington nodded. "Good. Keep it that way. Actions speak louder than orders. Remember it." Over the next days, James noticed subtle changes. The crew no longer flinched when he spoke. Junior officers sought his opinion. Even senior sailors, who once viewed him as inexperienced and brash, now consulted him during drills. His voice carried authority, not fear. His presence inspired confidence, not intimidation. It was a delicate balance, and he cherished it. He understood now that leadership wasn't about being feared, it was about being relied upon. During a navigation drill, he spotted a junior officer struggling with the charts. Instead of snapping orders, he knelt beside him, guiding his hands over the lines, explaining the calculations with patience. "Thank you, sir," the officer whispered. James smiled. "You'll do fine. Just remember, always check twice, trust your instincts, but never let pride cloud judgment." Harrington, watching from the bridge, allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Her student was learning. Word of James's performance spread beyond the Resolute. During fleet exercises, other vessels reported his tactical decisions had been precise and effective. His crew's cohesion became a model for other destroyers. Officers who had once doubted him began to see the lieutenant in a new light, not as the arrogant cad who had cornered the Admiral, but as a capable leader who had faced real danger and emerged stronger. And James felt it, the slow, steady bloom of respect, not demanded, not enforced, but earned. Yet Harrington's mentorship didn't end with praise. She continued to push him, testing his judgment and resolve. One afternoon, she gathered him on the bridge for a simulated command exercise. Enemy vessels, radar blips, and chaotic weather were projected across the screens. James was placed in command. At first, he hesitated. Old habits, the arrogance, The desire to dominate whispered in his mind. But he pushed them down, recalling the lessons Harrington had drilled into him. Calm, measured, deliberate, he guided his crew, listening, adapting, and making decisions that balanced aggression with prudence. By the end of the exercise, Harrington's expression was unreadable for a long moment. Then she simply said, "Well done, Lieutenant. You've learned the difference between command and control. Don't forget it." James exhaled, relief and pride mingling in equal measure. That night, the Admiral summoned him to her private quarters, a rare honor. The room was modest, yet every surface spoke of history and purpose. Maps marked with deployments, medals carefully displayed, books stacked neatly on naval strategy. Harrington motioned for him to sit. "You've done well," she said simply. "But remember, leadership is never static. It's a living thing. Every decision has consequences. Every choice matters. You've earned respect, yes, but you must keep earning it." James nodded, absorbing her words. "I understand, ma'am. I won't forget." Harrington leaned back in her chair. "Good, because the fleet doesn't reward pride. It rewards competence, judgment, and integrity. And now, Lieutenant, it's time to show what you've truly learned." He felt a surge of anticipation. The real test was coming. The next morning, disaster struck in the form of an unexpected storm in the Gulf. The fleet was scattered, communications down, and smaller vessels at risk of capsizing. James was assigned to coordinate rescue operations for several compromised destroyers. As he moved from bridge to bridge, issuing orders and monitoring crew safety, he felt the weight of responsibility in every step. There were no rehearsals, no simulations, only real sailors depending on him, only real danger looming with every crashing wave. Hours passed, each decision critical. Rerouting ships to avoid submerged obstacles, adjusting speeds to maintain formation, coordinating with medical teams for injured sailors. He acted decisively, calmly, and with clarity born from weeks of Harrington's mentorship. By dawn, the storm had passed. Every vessel had survived, casualties were minimal, and the fleet owed its cohesion to the leadership of Lieutenant James Carter. Later, Harrington addressed the crew during a debriefing. Her voice carried across the mess hall, calm and precise. Lieutenant Carter demonstrated true leadership during the storm. He made decisions under pressure, balanced aggression with prudence, and protected the lives of every sailor under his command. "He has earned your respect as well as my confidence." The room erupted in applause. Sailors stood, clapping, cheering. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the culmination of weeks of trials, lessons, and personal growth. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the crew. Their trust, hard-won and genuine, was a far greater reward than any medal or commendation. Harrington approached him after the debriefing. "You've come far, Lieutenant," she said. "But never forget the sea is merciless. Pride leads to mistakes. Respect and responsibility save lives." James nodded, a quiet resolve settling over him. He had been tested, humbled, and forged anew. And he would carry these lessons for the rest of his career. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly lead, not to dominate, not to command, but to serve those who depended on him. The journey was far from over, but the lieutenant who had cornered the Admiral in a corridor was gone. In his place stood a leader the fleet could rely upon. And Fleet Admiral Evelyn Harrington, observing silently from her position, allowed herself the faintest smile of approval. The fleet's mission had escalated beyond routine exercises. Intelligence reports indicated a rogue faction had seized control of a critical shipping route, threatening not only supply lines, but countless civilian lives. The threat was imminent, and the Navy's eyes turned to the Resolute and its command team. Lieutenant James Carter stood on the bridge, staring out at the horizon where darkness blurred into dawn. The sea was deceptively calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. Harrington stood beside him, calm as ever, her presence a silent anchor. He no longer felt fear of her authority. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility she had taught him to carry, the responsibility of every sailor aboard, every decision that could save or cost lives. "Report," Harrington said, her voice steady. "Rogue vessels are 2 nautical miles from the convoy, approaching from multiple directions. They're heavily armed, and intelligence indicates coordination. Casualties expected if we engage directly," James replied, scanning the radar, recalling every lesson, every drill, every moment of restraint he had been taught. Harrington nodded. "Your call, Lieutenant." His pulse quickened. This was it, the culmination of weeks under her tutelage. Every lesson, every failure, every small triumph had led to this moment. He drew a deep breath. "Deploy defensive formations around the convoy," he ordered. "Secondary vessels engage only if the threat is imminent. Maintain communication, but do not provoke until absolutely necessary. Weapons on standby. We protect first, strike second." The Admiral studied him for a long moment. Then, with a faint nod, she stepped aside, allowing him full command. The attack came swiftly. Rogue vessels surged forward, engines howling, weapons primed. The convoy was vulnerable, civilian ships moving slowly and unpredictably. James's hands flew over the console, issuing orders with precision, coordinating multiple ships and personnel simultaneously. He remembered Harrington's words. "Leadership isn't shouting orders. It's guiding your team to trust your judgment, even under fire." Minutes stretched into eternity. Missteps could mean disaster. Yet, through his calm command, the fleet moved as a single entity, responding to threats, protecting the convoy, and maintaining cohesion. The first shots rang out warning flares from rogue craft, but the Resolute held its position. James analyzed patterns, predicted movements, and issued countermeasures that minimized risk while maximizing pressure. Slowly, the rogue vessels faltered, disoriented by the disciplined coordination. A critical moment arrived when a rogue craft targeted a cargo ship carrying essential humanitarian supplies. Without hesitation, James ordered an intercept. The Resolute's secondary battery fired precise, non-lethal disabling rounds, crippling the vessel's engines and forcing it to retreat. The cargo ship sailed unscathed. Harrington observed quietly, her eyes revealing the faintest hint of pride. She had trained him, challenged him, and now she watched as he applied every lesson in real time. The remaining rogue vessels, recognizing the discipline and skill of the Navy's response, disengaged. Within the hour, the convoy was secure, the threat neutralized without unnecessary loss of life. A bridge erupted in subdued cheers. Officers and crew alike began to grasp the transformation they had witnessed. Lieutenant James Carter, once brash and arrogant, had become a leader in the truest sense. After the engagement, Harrington summoned him to the Admiral's private quarters once more. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, maps of past campaigns lining the walls. She gestured for him to sit. "You did well," she said, voice calm, measured. "You protected lives, maintained composure, and earned the trust of your crew under extreme pressure. That is leadership. Not the kind taught in manuals, but the kind forged in reality." James exhaled, feeling the tension in his body finally release. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance." She studied him for a long moment, then finally smiled. "You've learned well, Lieutenant. The corridor incident seems a distant memory now, doesn't it?" He allowed himself a small chuckle. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Harrington's gaze softened slightly. "Remember, lessons never truly end." You will face new challenges, tougher decisions, and the weight of command will always test you. But if you lead with the integrity, judgment, and respect you demonstrated today, you'll honor both your crew and the Navy itself." James nodded. He felt a sense of completion, not just for the mission, but for his journey from arrogance to responsibility. Over the next few weeks, James continued to prove himself. Officers sought his counsel. Sailors worked under him with confidence rather than fear. In every exercise, every drill, every mission, he applied Harrington's teachings, blending strategy with empathy, discipline with understanding. And slowly, the whispers shifted. No longer were they mutters of ridicule or doubt. Now they spoke of his competence, his fairness, and his steady hand under pressure. He had earned something far greater than medals. He had earned respect. During one evening inspection, a junior officer approached him quietly. "Lieutenant Carter, thank you. You kept us safe." James smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on the officer's shoulder. "We kept each other safe. That's what matters." He looked out at the horizon, the sea calm once more, reflecting stars that seemed to shine with quiet approval. Months later, James received orders for promotion. Captain, effective immediately. He stood on the bridge one last time as lieutenant, looking at the crew he had led, the ship he had learned to command with skill and integrity. He thought of Harrington, the woman who had cornered him, challenged him, and transformed him into a leader worthy of command. When Harrington approached, she offered the faintest of nods. "You're ready," she said. He returned the salute, feeling the pride and humility of someone who had earned it. "Thank you, Admiral," he replied. "No," she said softly. "Thank yourself. You chose to learn, to change, and to lead. That's what matters." And for the first time in his career, James Carter truly understood what it meant to wear a uniform, not as a symbol of power, but as a symbol of responsibility, honor, and service. The story of Lieutenant James Carter's transformation spread throughout the fleet, becoming a quiet legend. Officers referenced it as an example of leadership forged in humility and tested by fire. Sailors recounted the tale of the young officer who had once cornered a fleet admiral, only to rise under her guidance to become a leader of true merit. For Harrington, it was a reminder of why she had chosen to mentor him instead of punishing him. Leadership was not about creating followers. It was about shaping capable leaders. And James had proven himself worthy. On the final night aboard the Resolute, James stood on deck, staring at the calm, endless horizon. The wind whispered promises of future challenges. Waves lapped gently against the hull, and the stars above shone cold but clear. He thought back to that first encounter in the corridor. The arrogance, the mistake, the humiliation. That moment had defined him, yes, but not in shame. It had defined him in the most profound way possible, as the beginning of a journey toward true leadership, respect, and integrity. Fleet Admiral Evelyn Harrington stood beside him, silent, steady, a guiding presence in the vastness of the ocean. James Carter, once brash and reckless, now stood tall, not just in rank, but in character. The lieutenant had become a captain. The man who had cornered an admiral had learned to stand beside her as a true leader. And as the moonlight danced on the waves, casting silver paths across the sea, James finally understood the journey never truly ends. But with wisdom, courage, and respect, he could navigate whatever storms lay ahead. The Resolute sailed on, a symbol of endurance, discipline, and the legacy of leadership passed from one generation to the next.